Welcome to the November Voyage Fromage. This month's theme is sheep's milk cheese. And I already see some wine, which I love to see because sheep's milk cheese is one of the friendliest cheeses for pairing with wine. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But I'm assuming everybody has all their cheeses laid out in front of them. We will be starting. I'm going to go over the order of the cheeses first, so you have them all in order. So we're going to be starting with the Famille Mignon cheese. The next cheese is going to be Brebis d'Auvergne. The third cheese we're going to be enjoying is the Vermont Shepherd Invierno. And then the last cheese we're going to be talking about is the Pecorino di Pienza Gran Reserva. And this month, we decided to give you the Maison Pruneau prune cream preserve. And prune is just French for plum. So it's just a plum jam. But this is from the famous region in France known for their Agen prunes, which are actual dried plums. A beautiful sort of luscious, creamy jam. It kind of mimics the mouthfeel of a sheep's milk cheese, which I love. It kind of just sort of coats your palate, but it's got a nice, gentle acidity. It's not too acidic of a jam at all. So it's great to pair with any of the cheeses that you're enjoying. And then for our cracker pairing, we decided to go with a really lovely local bakery to us in New England, the Seven Stars Bakery. This is a wonderful pumpkin seed bread. Seven Stars is located in Rhode Island, which is really not too far from us, and we get their bread delivered to us every single day. I would love feedback from people on how you enjoy the fresh bread. I grew up in a super, super rural area where we didn't have access to fresh bread unless we made it ourselves, which we did. And no offense to my mom, but it was not as good as a lot of the local bakeries that we work with at Formaggio Kitchen. And so it was sort of enlightening for me when I moved to Boston and had access to all this beautiful bread. So I hope you enjoy it, and definitely let us know if it's something that you want to keep seeing in your club, because we love shining a light on all these beautiful bakeries that we're working with. And we think it's a really fun way to experience cheeses, because for me, I think a lot of times the vessel that you put the cheese on is an afterthought. But it shouldn't be, because oftentimes there's just as much cracker or bread as cheese, and it needs to work together, balance together. And so we've got to give as much attention to the crackers and the bread as we do to the cheese itself to kind of honor everything. So that's my little spiel for the night. But we are going to start with a cheese that I'm so excited for you to try. Our very first cheese is the Famille Mignon Charlevoix cheese. I went on an epic adventure in Canada, in Quebec. I love maps. And oftentimes when I'm sort of quite literally mapping out my travel, I love looking at maps, seeing what makes sense, picking out points, and visually planning out my trip. I find that it helps keep me grounded if I kind of can see where I'm planning on going. The only problem with that I found with Canada, with how I was viewing the map, is how much further everything is away from each other than it looks like it is on the map. So I ended up going on a 1,300-mile journey, exploring different cheesemakers in Quebec. And it was such a long drive, but I was so grateful to meet all these producers that I'd never visited before. And so the furthest north that I went was to Charlevoix, which is about 2 hours north of Quebec City. And there I met Alex and Melin, and they are a brother and sister who have a family farm, and they make this beautiful cheese, which is a blend of sheep's milk and cow's milk. And this cheese technically is in the style of a raclette. They're in super northern Canada, so these sort of warming foods where you sort of melt a cheese over potatoes are very popular. And so you'll see with the texture, it's quite luscious. But back to Alex and Malène. It was a beautiful farm. They're actually winemakers as well. They do a lot on the farm, and they don't actually have the animals themselves on the farm. They work with very, very small dairies who are neighbors of them. And we talked a lot about that. And it was fascinating. And I learned a lot about the Canadian and specifically the Quebec dairy industry and how that impacts cheesemakers. What I didn't know when I went up there is that essentially the government owns all of the liquid milk production in Quebec. And even if you are a cheesemaker who has your own animals, you must actually purchase your own milk back from the government so that you can make your cheese. And so for some producers like Alex and Madeleine, it just wasn't sustainable to do that method. Now we work with other producers in Quebec who do have their own herds, and they do pay that premium. And there's pros and cons to everything, and there's pros and cons to this. But what they've decided to do is mimic the idea of a farmstead cheese, which is work with farmers that are their neighbors, that they know very, very well, so that they trust the milk source, they know the milk source. But what's actually wonderful and freeing for them, which when you meet them, it makes perfect sense because they're complete free spirits. They're incredible, lovely people who love to experiment. They're making, for example, an eau de vie using the leftover whey from their cheese making. So they're really trying to experiment and use the ingredients around them. So the fact that they don't have to care for the animals and do the animal husbandry gives them a lot of freedom to be able to experiment and have their vineyards where they're growing their wine and making their wine and then making their cheeses. And it's all based on seasonality. This cheese really struck me because traditionally raclette is made with a cow's milk, whereas this is made with both cow and sheep's milk. And sheep's milk is the theme of the night tonight. And we are going to see a couple of blended cheeses, but each cheese has the similar theme of having sheep's milk in it. And what makes sheep's milk so different than the other two milk types that we traditionally see used in cheese making, which are cow and goat, is that sheep's milk has the highest fat content, much higher than cow or goat, but much higher, and also a higher protein content. So it is a very different texture, it's a different mouthfeel, and it's different flavor than you get from cow's milk or goat's milk. And that's why I mentioned before about wine. Well, I love to think about flavors as a visual. And so I talk about this a lot. I talk about, coats your palate like a blanket. I really like to think about and see how these flavors interact with one another. And the thing with sheep's milk that I love is it tends to be a fairly, it tends to not be too powerful, strong of a cheese, but it does coat your palate really nicely so that when you add in an element such as wine or another pairing, it almost sits on top of that like a pillow. So the cheese helps to elevate whatever you're enjoying. And especially with a very tannic ingredient, such as like a red wine, cheese, that fattiness from the cheese plays so, so, so nicely with it. I was so excited to meet these cheesemakers and share their cheeses. We really just got it into the shop for the first time a few weeks ago. I really wanted to have it in time for the club. So I'm really, really glad that I can share it with you tonight. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we're moving to the Brabito Bern, which is a cheese that, and I bisected this one so you can see a little bit of the rind. We've been working with this producer for quite some time. And this is a cheese from the Pyrenees. And what's actually really unique about tonight's selection is we wanted to show the different techniques of using sheep's milk in different regions around the world. So we have cheese from Canada, we have cheese from France, we have cheese from the United States, and we have a cheese from Italy. So you can really see how each country utilizes their cheeses. You see influences for sure, especially amongst the Canadian and Americans. You see European influences because cheese making in, North America is still relatively young. So you're always going to see some level of influence from European cheesemakers. But you also see some standalone features, which I find really, really interesting. So we are moving on to a classic cheese from the Pyrenees. And this is a very traditional shepherd's cheese. And by that, I mean that they still move the herd of sheep or the flock of sheep from the lower fields to the higher pastures and the high mountains, because the Béarn is in the Pyrenees. And so once you get to the Pyrenees, it's pretty incredible. I grew up in Oregon, so I grew up hiking and camping a lot. And ambitious young me, when I first started working at Formaggio Kitchen, it was 2008 or 2007, I decided to go backpacking in the Pyrenees. And I learned that not only should I look at maps, but I should look at topographical maps, because I really, really experienced how extreme the elevation change is. And you learn what these shepherds, have to overcome. And during the backpacking, we would see these little shepherds' huts high up on the mountainside, really, really, really steep slope, where the shepherds would rest, sleep, maybe spend a night, have provisions there. And there's no fences anywhere. All of the sheep are just marked by spray paint, so you can differentiate one herd from another. And really, really hard, rugged, unique, rustic way of handling your sheep. And so is located in the Béarn, and an Alphineur is someone who ages cheese. And we get these cheeses from Etienne, and Etienne sources beautiful cheese from these shepherds in the Béarn. And what I love about a Pyrenees cheese, I think the most striking thing for me is the delicate nature of it. I remember when I was a newer cheesemonger, I thought, I tasted the cheese really fast, and I think I might have said out loud, "This is boring," which I probably shouldn't have said. And my manager at the time and the person who was helping to train me become a better cheesemonger, because we're always learning, said, "Slow down, taste it again." And so I stopped. I tasted it again, a bigger piece, after I'd already tasted it the one time, and it blew me away. He said, "Stop, think about it. What are you tasting? Think about the flavors." And I realized that I was missing all the nuances there before, when I was rushing, just throwing it in my mouth, chewing it up and eating it. And yes, at first glance, it can seem like a pretty mild cheese. But after a few bites, you really start to think about it, savor it. You can enjoy it with the rind or without the rind. That's one thing that I love about these cheeses, because they tend to be about 6 to 9 months old, which I think is really the turning point for rinds, where after 9 months or so, they tend to get a little bit too hard, at least for my own palate, for it to be enjoyable. So these can really influence your cheese tasting experience if you want something slightly earthier. or you can just enjoy the delicate interior. This is one of the most famous regions in the world for sheep's milk cheeses. And they have been making cheeses in this way for generations, working with smaller herds and artisan production so that you're not getting this sort of mass-produced cheese. And I think that's why it's so beautiful. And you also get a ton of variability in this cheese. It is crazy how much it cheeses from batch to batch. And a lot of that has to do with the season and what the animals are eating. As we've learned with all of our cheese tasting events and classes, you know, it really begins with the animals and what they're eating and enjoying and how that impacts the final flavor of the cheese. And this Brebis de Haute Berne, I think segues perfectly into our next cheese, because our next cheese is a Vermont cheese called Vermont Shepherd Invierno. And that's a slightly harder cheese. It's not the hardest of the bunch, but it's a little bit harder. And David, the cheesemaker from Vermont Shepherd, actually trained in the Pyrenees. He wanted to learn how to make cheeses. And so he went to the Pyrenees and learned how to make cheese from the sheep's milk cheese and traditional Pyrenees cheeses from the Pyrenees, and then came back and started making cheeses in the US. Sheep's milk cheese in the US is very uncommon, especially amongst artisan makers. Well, artisan or non-artisan, to be honest. Why is that? And that goes back to our theme today of sheep's milk. Logistically speaking, sheep's milk is not financially smart or profitable. And you have an animal that's, you know, requires quite a bit of feed. It's not as small as a goat, but the yield of milk is quite low. And sheep, unless you're introducing other elements, will have to be dried off for a period of time. So there's going to be a period of time during the year that they're not producing milk. So unlike cows, which can produce 12 months out of the year, unlike cows, which can produce 12 months out of the year, you have an animal that, you know, only produces, you know, for 9 months, 10 months out of the year. So you're losing that yield then as well. And what's fascinating, and I actually learned when I visited David in Vermont, was throughout the year, the quality of the milk changes quite dramatically. And I don't mean that as good or bad when I say quality. I mean quality as in the structure and the presentation of the milk. So I mentioned how fatty sheep's milk cheese is. What David was telling me is in the wintertime, he has to make his cheese with blended milk, which is what this is. This is sheep and cow. And he gets the cow's milk from his neighbor, who's another cheesemaker that we also work with. You know, and I said, why? You know, in addition to, you know, many of his sheep being dried off at that time and his yield being very, very low, it is because he said that the milk is so fatty during the wintertime when they are eating really fatty, rich foods, like hay and grain, that he said it's almost not even a liquid state anymore. He said it's like a yogurty like quality. It's so fat and so rich. It makes it incredibly difficult to make cheese with it. And I thought that's fascinating that it could change structurally so much from season to season. So that was one thing that I learned. And he has a very small farm. It's about 245 acres, which is, for me, fascinating because that's exactly how many acres I grew up on. And so I can actually visualize how big his farm is, which is really nice for me because that's quite small for a farm. And when we visited, of course, we went out with his border collies to go collect the sheep and bring them back. And he then took us to the make room and he showed us the level of rusticity of what he's doing. And that is two parts. The two things that stood out to me the most were the baskets that he uses to drain after he separates the curds and the whey. He puts the cheeses into baskets. And when I say baskets, I mean more like a very old-fashioned colander from like the 50s or 60s. Very flimsy. They're all different shapes and sizes. And he puts two together, and that's how he flips them, and that's how he drains the cheeses. I do not think any two of his cheeses are the same shape. They are all so wonky and unique and beautiful, and I love it, and he loves it, and that is a level of rusticity that he enjoys in his cheese making, that they don't have to be perfectly uniform, perfectly even, and I think it adds to kind of the uniqueness of him as a cheesemaker. The other thing, the story that has never left me and has actually kind of created, I wouldn't call it an obsession, but maybe an unhealthy interest in brine. Many cheeses are brined to add salt to them. So they're literally dipped in this brine solution. And it's a very, very important part of cheese making. It's one of the most critical aspects of cheese making if you're making a brined cheese. And, you know, we were chatting and he had this beautiful vat of brine. And he said, "Let me tell you a story." And I said, "Okay." And he's like, "One time I had an intern, really good intern, really eager, didn't know anything about cheese making, but always wanted to help, always on top of the game, always trying to do things around the farm to make life easier." And he's like, "I'd never had an intern before. I wasn't really sure what to expect, but wasn't really sure what to expect. But, you know, it was nice. It was nice to have someone there to help." And he said he came into the room where the brine tank was, and the intern had emptied the brine tank. And every time I tell a cheesemaker this story, their eyes just go wide and their face sinks, because to give you context, we've tasted cheeses from Belgium. And that's the oldest brine that I've ever experienced. It's a 40-year-old brine. They never, ever change that water and salt. Like, you can add to it, but you never drain it. You never completely get rid of it, because you are basically dealing at this point with a living, breathing organism in this brine mixture. And when you get it tailored to the perfect level, it affects the pH of your cheese. And the pH of your cheese is going to impact your rind development tremendously. If the pH is too high, the rind is going to slip off your cheese. And it's going to be an absolute nightmare if you're trying to make a beautiful aged cheese like this. He said that for months, he couldn't get the rind to stay on the cheeses. And it just was never, you know, it took such a long time to get back to where it was. And so I always loved that. And I always kind of now look at brine as the elixir of life, you know, that it really does breathe life into these cheeses. And it's a statement of every cheese that has come before it. And it's adding beautiful complexity, uniqueness, and then the necessities of salt to the cheeses of the future. So for me, it's just this very romantic statement of what goes into cheese making. And I think it's fascinating and unique. And it's something that I absolutely, now it's like one of the things that I always ask about every time I visit a cheesemaker. I'm like, "Show me your brine." They're like, "Really? You want to see the brine?" And I'm like, "Yes, I want to see the brine." Just because I think it's such a special, overlooked aspect of cheese making. Now, this cheese, as I mentioned, is that blend of sheep's milk from his herd and cow's milk from his neighbor's herd, which is Parish Hill Creamery. He also does, he only makes 2 types of cheeses, hard cheeses like this. He makes this cheese in the winter, and then in the summer, he makes Verano, which is 100% sheep's milk. So in the summertime, you can enjoy the version that is 100% sheep's milk. This is the wintertime version when really he just cannot just use the sheep's milk because it's too rich, it's too fatty. This is another cheese. The rind on this one is getting a little bit old. I would still eat it. There's nothing wrong with it. It just depends if you want it to be a little bit earthier. But I do think that the smell of this cheese is beautiful. And you get the heft of the sheep's milk. You'd think after doing all of these videos, I'd learn to take smaller bites of cheese, but we're not there yet. All right, so I hope that you love those so far. I find that, again, the reason that I picked the jam pairing for this is because of the fact that it's not so acidic, that with the milder cheeses, it doesn't overwhelm them. But with these 2 intense cheeses that we're finishing with, the stronger kind of bolder cheeses, you actually taste a lot of the nuance and the undertones of the cheeses when you add in the element of the prune cream. The other thing about, and this is my only mention of lactose, is that sheep's milk does have less lactose than cow's milk. Oftentimes, folks are very excited to try sheep's milk cheeses. It still contains lactose. Pure sheep's milk has less lactose than cow's milk. Sheep's milk cheeses has far less lactose because the processing of making cheese reduces the lactose as well. So it is a great option if you're lactose intolerant, as long as it's not too severe. Just a fun fact for those. But we always say there are tons of options for those who are lactose intolerant, because once a cheese reaches about a year, we say usually it's 9 months, but I'd say if you're being extra cautious, you want to go to about a year, your cheese is going to be lactose free. And so that's a good eye-opening thing for folks who are lactose intolerant to learn, because it really opens up a world of opportunity for them to enjoy cheeses again. Okay, now we're moving to Italy, the hardest cheese by far. This is actually a very old cheese given the size of the wheel. Trying to think of how to describe how big this wheel is. It is about that tall, and probably, gosh, each wheel is probably, I don't want to guess the weight, 20 pounds or so. It would be my closest guess. So it's not a tiny wheel. Oftentimes in Italy, you see teeny tiny pecorinos. It's not a massive wheel. It's not anything like a pecorino romano or anything massive like that. It's a really nice in between. Because of the larger size, it lends itself to aging very, very, very nicely without breaking down the structure too much. So this cheese is from Emilio and Graziano, who are the children of the founders of Fattoria Bucanuova, and a family operation that actually began in Sardinia. So a Sardinian family, there were a lack of opportunities in Sardinia. I've actually never been to Sardinia. I've always wanted to go. It's on my list. But it is a very rural, very unique place that is very cut off from even the rest of Europe. And so it can be challenging for someone who is in agriculture or food to be able to get their product elsewhere, and to have a really sustainable living doing that. So they kept some of their heritage with them. And so what they did is they moved to Pienza, Italy, and they brought their Sardinian sheep. So the sheep that they're using in Pienza, so Pienza is a classic cheese-making region in Italy, and it's known for their sheep's milk. For them, they really specifically wanted to keep the Sardinian breed of sheep that their family used growing, traditionally when they were in Sardinia. And so the parents, when they moved to Pienza, they made cheese, and it was generally a family operation. And then when Emilio and Graziano took over, they decided to expand it slightly. And so not only are they making cheeses, but they're actually doing affinage now as well, where they are sourcing cheeses from other small makers and aging in their caves as well. And so the fun part about watching a lot of these multi-generational cheesemakers is seeing how they adapt and change and grow, or in some cases pull back and get smaller, depending on the situation. And so it's a really great statement to what they're doing. This is, I would say, it's a non-traditional, traditional Italian pecorino is the best way to say it, because it's so, when you go to Italy, everything is very regionally focused. And it's the perfect name for an Italian pecorino. It is Pecorino di Pienza, so which means sheep's milk from Pienza, Gran Reserva, which is essentially very old or very special, the great reserve. And that's what you see in Italy. You see, 20 cheeses at the market, all called pecorino, or, pecorino in folia, which is pecorino in leaves. They're very literal. And so you don't often see a lot of distinction between producers in the naming of the cheeses as when you get to Pienza. This, I look at the technique and the details. And so when you look at the rind, you can see the traditional Sardinian basket weave. And so the basket weaving is, they would use a traditional basket to drain the curd, just like I was talking about how David at Vermont Shepherd used the colanders. In Sardinia, they had these weaved baskets. And so a classic feature of Sardinian cheeses is this sort of basket weave on the rind, because as you allow the cheese to sit and drain, it actually molds to the shape of the basket that it's in. And then the size, very, very strategic and smart size when you're doing a Gran Reserva cheese, a cheese that's aged over a year. If this cheese were small, it would be, it would be piquant, it would be rock hard, it would be very crumbly, it wouldn't be quite as palatable. This cheese, they picked a size that's truly incredible so that you get the balance of, when you look at this cheese and you break it, like you see how it shreds like that? That's age. There's almost no moisture left in this cheese, and that's wonderful. But the key is when you taste it and put it, okay, come here. My dog desperately wants a little piece of cheese. When you taste it, so it's fine if it's sort of, I say dry in quotations because it's lacking in moisture. So that definition of dry. Dry has a negative connotation when you're talking about food. So then put it in your mouth. Let's try it. All right, I'm learning. I'm going to do a smaller piece. And the smell, the fragrance of this cheese is so, so nice and so reminiscent of a really nice aged Italian pecorino. Completely, when you chew it, dissipates, coats your palate. Like, you're not chewing sawdust. You're not chewing wood. It's got all the moisture that you want the second that you put it in your mouth. And that's why I think this cheese is so exceptional and so beautiful and highlights why, this cheese couldn't be made in the same way with cow's milk because it doesn't, because of that fat content, because you're pulling all the moisture in. So it needs something to coat your palate. So it's reaching for the fat, and that's what you get. And that's what's so beautiful about this cheese. And they've just figured out, you know, the perfect size and the perfect age to really have a cheese that's aged to this extreme, but still has such a luscious texture and a flavor that is intense, but it's not biting. And when I say biting, sometimes you get cheeses that are aged so much that they kind of pierce the top of your palate. And if it's too intense, or you get that butyric acid flavor, which is a level of pungency that is just not really that palatable. And so this really shows a mastery of cheese making and cheese aging, which is why I love it so much. And this one in particular, like if you had a truffle honey, that with this cheese would just be absolutely killer. So, but there's a lot you can do with this. Really nice with wines. I mean, you can imagine, you know, some beautiful Italian, you know, like a Barbera, something that's hefty but not too tannic would just be absolutely beautiful with this cheese. One. And lastly, as we kind of wrap up tonight's tasting, the naming of sheep's milk cheese, I've referenced many times. I've said Brebis, I've said Pecorino, but one thing I want to make so clear is that the name Brebis just means sheep cheese in French. The name, let me think. You've got Pecorino, which is sheep cheese in Italian. So a lot of times, especially in the US, people hear Pecorino and they immediately think Pecorino Romano, which is a style of cheese from Lazio, but it's not, but it's just a Pecorino at its core. Pecorino is different than the Romano part, you know, and if you think about how a lot of Italian cheeses are named, again, it's very, very basic and quite literal. So it is a sheep milk cheese from Romano, or in this case, a sheep's milk cheese from Pienza. So Pecorino, all that means is sheep cheese. And so you'll see this a lot. You'll see, you know, Robiola Pecora or Robiola, like Pecorino Robiola. So that could be a soft sheep's milk cheese. You can, let's see, Ardigazna is a little bit more obscure, but Ardigazna means sheep cheese in the Basque dialect. So if you love sheep cheese, oftentimes, because it's just generally not as common of a cheese in the grand scheme of things, oftentimes they include sheep cheese in the name, whether it's Pecorino, Brebis, Pecora, something like that, they will typically include in the name. So it's a really good indicator for you to watch out for as you're selecting cheeses, as you're looking for cheeses. Typically, if you love sheep's milk cheeses, you'll see it right there in the name. So hopefully that helps as you're kind of moving along with your cheese education and cheese selection. Does anybody have any questions before we close out for the night?
Go ahead, Richard. The Vermont cheese, how far up in Vermont is it? Is it in the middle of up near Burlington? Is it southern part?
It's southern, no, southwestern-ish. It's like an hour away from Amherst, if that helps.
Oh, all right.
So
Close
it's not
the Berkshires.
Yeah. So it's really not that. I was shocked because my in-laws are in Amherst, and I couldn't believe how close it was to Amherst. So it's really, really not that far of a drive. So you're not going way up north to like Burlington, Greensboro, or anything like that. So, and it's right next door to Parish Hill Creamery, who makes gorgeous cow's milk cheeses. And that's where he gets his cow's milk from. So it's a very special little area.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions?
You have any?
Which pecorino do you suggest for pasta?
Oh, that's a good question. My favorite, I would have to say I have two right now. I love Cenerino, which is a pecorino from Italy that's covered in ash. It references a chimney sweep. That's what the name references. And it's a little bit brighter and more acidic. And I love to use a vegetable peeler to peel it. So you get ribbons of cheese on the pasta or on a salad or something like that. And then Pecorino is my other favorite cheap smoked cheese for pastas right now. Both of them are very similar profile wise, and they're a little bit more tart and lemony. I just find that they're just a really, really nice kind of bright addition to a pasta. But this Grand Reserva, I would use in a heartbeat. So kind of just depends on flavor profile and what you're looking for. But I like that sort of lighter, brighter, more kind of lemony flavor profile when I'm having pastas.
And it sounds like those two pecorinos are at the shop, but not on the website. Because I always go back and forth between what's on the website.
Got it. The Cinerinos probably not on the website because it's pretty limited. Polyreno sometimes is, but you can always email my shipping manager. Well, she is her name's Louisa, and we have so many folks who shop at Formaggio in the store, and then they might move away or they might want to send something that they love to friends. So we always can customize if there's not something you find on the website. It's totally fine. And I just wanted to update everybody. I know originally we said that next month was going to be Parmesan. We've pivoted because our Parmesan shipment is delayed. And so it's just cutting it too close and we're not going to risk it. So we're going to do a Tour de France next month. So we're going to feature different regions and different cheese making styles from different regions of France, from the Auvergne to the Pyrenees, to the Jura up north. We're going to do a wide variety so you kind of hit all the different regions and traditions. So it'll be fun. And we'll save Parmesan for next year.
That's great.
So that's actually coming up pretty soon. So believe it or not.
Too soon.
It'll be here before we know it. But does anybody have any questions before we sign off tonight?
This was great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Of course. It was so nice to see you. Thank you again for joining. And as always, if you have questions, you can email me directly, which is just julia@formaggio.kitchen.com, or you can, if you want to order anything special that we might not have on the website, you can email our shipping manager at orders@formaggio.kitchen.com.